am making a meatloaf with a hot honey sauce. And this is actually one of the first things I ever made my husband when we were dating. So this is a family favorite. You can get this recipe over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. I'll leave a link for that in the description box below. But simply, it is 2 pounds of ground beef, 2 eggs, a little bit of Worcestershire sauce, which I think I actually said correctly for the first time, steel cut oats, which is one of the secret ingredients. The other secret ingredient is celery seed, and then a little bit of fresh or dried parsley. And then I also put in some sauteed onions. Many times I have made this without cooking the onions first, and it still turns out totally fine. It is a little bit better if you cook the onions first. And then I'm simply just mixing this up by hand. I try not to overwork it, but I do use my hands, which is like kind of funky sometimes because I just can't get those ingredients combined as well with a spoon. And now I am putting this in a regular old loaf pan and making the hot honey sauce. So this is a combination of ketchup, honey, sriracha, and cumin. And over on my blog, I have sort of what I think are the ideal measurements for that sauce, but you can really adjust it however it suits your preferences. If you want it a little sweeter or a little spicier or a little more or less cumin, definitely you can adjust them. And I'm putting that glaze on top of the meat and then baking this at 350 for about an hour. Now, the problem I run into with this every single time is my husband always says there's never enough sauce, so I recommend making an extra batch for dipping. The steel cut oats really hold this together and make it nice and hearty. So when you cut into it, it doesn't fall apart like a lot of other meatloaf recipes do. It really holds together. Sometimes I see these meatloaf recipes with broth and they're always too soft. This one is really nice and hearty and holds together. The menu is chicken and pastry, and depending on where you live, you might know this as chicken and dumplings. To make this, I'm first just cooking a whole chicken. Now, you could do this in the Instant Pot, a crock pot. I'm just doing it on the stove today because I have the time to let it cook on the stove. And also, I really like the quality of the broth for something like chicken and pastry when it's made on the stove. So I just put the chicken in there and I filled it up with enough water to mostly cover the chicken, and I let it cook for about 2 to 3 hours. And I'm taking the chicken out to cool off enough so I can pick it. And that broth is vital to this recipe, so I'm just setting that aside for a few minutes. And in the meantime, I am making the pastry or dumplings. My husband is Southern and he grew up eating food like this, and he said he grew up calling this chicken and dumplings. I learned it as chicken and pastry, but I've also heard it called chicken pastry, chicken slick, all sorts of different names, but the sentiment is the same. It's just a simple combination of flour, butter, milk, and salt. Now, I have been using mostly fresh milled flour in my recipes, but for this, I really wanted that classic flavor and texture, so I'm using regular all-purpose flour. But you could definitely make this with fresh milled flour. I just published an article about how to convert all-purpose flour to fresh milled flour for any recipe. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out there. I'll leave a link in the description box. So once you get the ingredients combined, you just mix them together, and then you really don't want to work it too much. So I needed this, I'd say somewhere between 10 and 15 times just to bring the ingredients together. And then I let it rest on the counter while I pick the chicken. And that just lets that gluten relax a little bit so it's easier to roll in a few minutes. One of the things I really appreciate about country cooking and Southern cooking is that the ingredients are always simple and the process is simple. It's usually a combination of flour, butter, and some sort of protein. And I just mentioned a few weeks ago in my old-fashioned frugality video that when you are cooking from scratch, that is key. Keeping simple ingredients on hand and keeping the process really simple too. Everything tastes good with a little butter, salt, and pepper. It doesn't have to be complicated. So now that the chicken is picked, I am boiling about half of that broth, and now I'm rolling out the dough. So this is a pretty sticky dough. So if you make this, I would anticipate having to generously flour your counter and the top of the dough, but just roll it out to about a 1/4 inch thickness. And I'm using a pizza cutter just to cut it in little rectangles. You can make it thinner, you can make the rectangles longer. It's really up to you. You kind of can't go wrong here. in my cast iron Dutch oven, I put about half of the chicken broth and I strained it. And I like to use about half because you can always add more, but I don't really like this to be soupy. It really has like a creamy gravy-like texture. And I add that pastry in just one at a time or a couple at a time just to prevent them from sticking together. And once they're all in there, I'm bringing it to a boil and just seasoning it really simply with some salt, pepper, and sage. This is actually very good with poultry seasoning if you have it, but I did not have any on hand. But you can season it however you like. But again, in the spirit of country and southern cooking, just keep it really simple and let those flavors of the pastry and the chicken shine. Once the pastry was cooked, I then just added back in some of the chicken. I think I used about half to maybe 3/4 of the chicken. I tend to like a little more pastry than chicken in my chicken and pastry, but you can add as much or as little as you prefer. Next up is one of my all-time favorite slow cooker meals, slow cooker lasagna. So here I am taking cottage cheese instead of ricotta, and this is actually homemade cottage cheese. I just shared how to make homemade cottage cheese on my Sunday reset video last week, so I will leave that in the description box below. But I am mixing together homemade cottage cheese, a little bit of Parmesan cheese, and a whole lot of shredded mozzarella cheese. Now you could totally get store-bought shredded mozzarella cheese. I prefer to shred it myself because it melts a little bit better, but any of that will work. And then I am just dicing up a half of an onion. One of the things I like to do lately is just use a half an onion in my recipes. It saves just a little bit of money, and I found that a whole onion doesn't really add much more flavor than a half of an onion, so it's just a little bit easier and cheaper. And now I am making just a really simple sauce. You could make any pasta sauce that you prefer. So I am just browning some ground beef, and then I'm adding in that diced half of an onion. And then I'm adding in a large can of tomato sauce. I will say I wish I would have used a large can and a regular, I think it's like a 14-ounce can of tomato sauce. I was just a little bit short, so I would use a little more if I were you. And then I also usually add tomato paste to this, but I don't have any, so I'm adding in a little bit of freeze-dried tomato skins. You probably saw me do this earlier in the summer when I was freeze-drying and preserving tomatoes. And then you just season it however you want it. A little bit of garlic powder to keep it easy, some Italian seasoning. Don't overthink it. Just make a simple tomato sauce. And then it is time to build your lasagna. You only have to mix the cheese and make the sauce to do this. So to layer the lasagna, I'm adding just a little bit of sauce to the bottom of a casserole dish. You could use your regular slow cooker dish for this. I have a different type of slow cooker that you'll see in a minute. And then a double layer of uncooked lasagna noodles. Just get the plain old regular lasagna noodles and put them in there dry. And then add the cheese and then start all over again. Sauce, noodles, cheese. Layer your lasagna until you are out of ingredients and ending with a nice thick layer of cheese and sauce. And then this goes right into your slow cooker. Now I use a Bruden Taylor proofer and slow cooker. So I use a casserole dish and put the lid right on top of the casserole dish and then the slow cooker lid over that. But you can just put the lid right on your slow cooker and call it a day. This cooked on low for about 5 hours. So this is not necessarily a recipe that you would start, say, at 5 a.m. and then would eat when you get home from work at 5 p.m. because it might be a little overcooked. But this is a super simple way to make lasagna. So if you are at home and you can start it in the afternoon, it'll be ready for dinner. Or I really like to make this on a Saturday or Sunday, so I have it for dinner on Monday. Earlier in the week, I was so busy with holiday happenings and also getting over a cold that while my husband was out running errands, I asked him to grab one of those pre-made meals from Costco. And no offense to Costco, but it was not good at all. In fact, we really couldn't even eat it. So we are skipping that and getting back to what we know best, and that is making easy scratch-made meals. I am starting with a very simple chicken and veggie skillet meal. So first I'm just frying up some bacon and then I'm taking it out of the skillet. And ideally this would go on a paper towel line plate, but it turns out I only had one little rectangle of a paper towel left. But I'm letting that drain on a plate while I prepare the veggies. I am using Brussels sprouts and sweet potatoes because that is what's seasonal and what is the best price, but you can use any vegetables that you have on hand or that you can find at a good price at your local grocery store. Skillet meals are really useful because there is minimal cleanup required. I also really like one pot meals. I actually posted a one pot meal video on YouTube a few weeks ago. I will leave a link for that below in the description box. I found that often for skillet meals though, I do have to cook one ingredient and then take it out. Like in this case, I had to cook the bacon and take it out, and you'll see I do that again in the following two recipes later in this video. Whereas with one pot meals, I don't really have to do that, but sometimes I do like to make skillet meals over one pot meals because it does create a little bit of a different flavor, and they're also really easy to batch cook, as you will see I did today. Now here I am chopping up some chicken, and one of the tricks to making a good skillet meal that cooks quickly is to make sure that the protein is cut up in bite-sized pieces. If you're waiting for that whole chicken breast to cook, that can take a really long time on the stovetop. So if you cube it up and get it in bite-sized pieces that are about the same size as the veggies, it cooks a little bit easier. And when you go to eat it, you can fit a little bit of sweet potato, Brussels sprout, and chicken all in one forkful, which makes for a delicious bite of food. When I make skillet meals like this, I do not wipe out the pan in between. I see a lot of recipes call for that. So I am cooking this chicken right in that bacon grease. Now, if your bacon has a lot of fat that rendered, you might want to take some of it out, but I am using that bacon fat and even some of those little burn bits to season the chicken. Once the chicken is close to being done, I'd say around like 150, 155 degrees Fahrenheit, I am pushing it over to one side of the skillet and adding the veggies so then they can cook together. That way you don't have to worry about taking the chicken out because it's going to overcook or anything like that. So it's just a little bit easier and creates a little less cleanup. And then I am seasoning this with a little bit of freeze-dried onion powder, some garlic powder, salt and pepper. Really, you can use any seasonings that you want. And now I am pouring in, I'd say maybe a half a cup to a cup of broth. Now here's the deal with adding broth to Brussels sprouts. It does make them very soft. So if you like a crispy Brussels sprout, I would not do this. I would just use a different vegetable altogether. The broth really helps this cook quickly, but it does make for soft vegetables, which I actually really love. I let that cook in the broth for about 10 minutes or so, and then I took the lid off and just let that broth cook all the way down. And then I'm adding in some of that bacon. I chopped it up like little bacon bits and a sprinkle of dried cranberries. And this was a really delicious and super easy skillet meal. We ate this for dinner. And then also this morning, my husband actually ate this for breakfast with the fried egg over it. And he said it was delicious like that. So this is really versatile for a number of different meals. And if you double up, then you can have plenty for leftovers. First, making a one pot Japanese chicken curry. I am currently working on getting this recipe on my blog over at moonandmagnolia.com. But while you wait for that, for this recipe, you will need about 2 pounds of chicken thighs, a little bit of avocado oil, salt and pepper to taste, about 3 tablespoons of butter, a half an onion chopped, 3 tablespoons of yellow curry powder, a little bit of ground ginger, a pinch of ground nutmeg, about 1.5 cups or so of white rice, 1 potato, 3 carrots, and 3 cups of chicken broth. First, I am just searing the chicken thighs on both sides in the avocado oil and butter. And while that is searing, I'm also chopping the veggies. Now, sometimes I have veggies pre-chopped, often on Sundays. I like to chop up onions and carrots and get those things ready to go. But if I don't have that, usually what I do is I kind of go back and forth between the stove and chopping. So that way there's sort of multiple things happening in the kitchen at one time. I'm not a huge fan of multitasking in the kitchen because cooking is a lot more enjoyable when you do one thing at a time, but weeknights often call for some multitasking. Once the chicken is out of the Dutch oven and resting, I am adding in the onion and just cooking it for a minute or two until it's tender crisp. Then to the onion, I am adding curry powder, ginger, and nutmeg. And I'm just cooking those spices in there until they become aromatic. And as soon as I can smell it, I'm adding in minced garlic. I always add in the garlic last just to make sure it doesn't burn, because burned garlic will ruin the whole dish. And then I am taking just a little bit of that chicken broth. That is homemade chicken broth that I'm using, but you can use store-bought too. And I'm deglazing the cast iron Dutch oven. All those little stuck burned bits are called fond, and so make sure you scrape those up because they add a lot of flavor to your food. So once the cast iron is deglazed, I am now just adding in the rest of the chicken broth, the rice, and then I am putting the vegetables in. which is simply just carrots and potatoes, and then putting the chicken back in and bringing the whole pot to a boil. Once it boils, I'm then putting a lid on it and transferring it to the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for about 25 minutes or so. So for a busy weeknight, this is nice because it takes about 45 minutes to make, but only 15 to 20 minutes of that is actual hands-on time. The rest of it is just in the oven, and you only have one Dutch oven to clean up. Now, just to make myself feel fancy, I serve this with some chopped green onions, which adds flavor. Oh, and some sesame seeds. If you want to feel fancy, just add sesame seeds to anything and it looks really fancy. And it was so good and so easy for a weeknight. A 1-pot turmeric and coconut rice. This is really more of a side, so I am assuming when you are making this that you maybe already have like a rotisserie chicken on hand or some leftover chicken breast, something like that. But for this, I first toasted up some sesame seeds and sweetened coconut in my Dutch oven. You could use unsweetened. I actually tried to use unsweetened, but the grocery store was out of it. So all they had was sweetened and it was still really delicious. Once that coconut is brown, then just take it out and put it in a dish and set it aside. And then it is time to make this really simple rice. To make this, I just put a little bit of coconut oil in the Dutch oven, and then I chopped up the white parts of a scallion and threw them in there. Once that became aromatic, I then added in 1 teaspoon or so of turmeric, a little bit of black pepper, and then cooked that again until it became aromatic. And then I tossed in a can of coconut oil, refilled that can with water and poured that in, added in 2 cups of rice, and brought this to a boil. And then like any rice dish, once it came to a boil, I dropped it to a simmer, put a lid on it. And while that cooked for 10 minutes, I got some kale ready. This was the most beautiful kale I got from a local grocery store, but you could also use chard or any other leafy green that you prefer. So I chopped up the kale, and after 10 minutes, I just put a layer of kale on top of that rice, put the lid back on, and let it simmer again for about 5 minutes. So that rice is finishing up cooking and then those greens are steaming in that time. Then after 5 minutes, take it off the heat and let it sit for another 5 minutes until those greens are nice and tender. I served this with the toasted coconut and sesame seed topping, some green onions, and then a little squeeze of lime. And this was so good. It was really light and refreshing, but also equally comforting. And I also added a side of leftover chicken, actually the same chicken that I made in my Sunday reset video last week, and it was delicious. I am making a giant pot of chicken corn chowder, and I'm using local corn that I froze from last year. So the thing about chowder, I feel like I'm saying a lot about summer foods and saying, oh, this isn't a summer food, but actually chowder is a summer soup, and it brings back a ton of memories. As a kid growing up in Maryland, going to the shore and eating crab chowder. So chowder really is, in my opinion, a summer food. So what I am doing here is I am just lightly cooking some bacon, taking it out, and then I am just searing some chicken thighs in that bacon grease. Then I'm also taking them out. I should note that you can make this recipe on the stove, you can make it in your Instant Pot or the slow cooker. I am doing the slow cooker today because I don't feel like sitting around dealing with my stove, and I don't feel like busting out my Instant Pot either. Then I'm just sauteing the vegetables, carrots, onions, red pepper in the fat and juices from the meat. Once they are tender crisp, I add the meat back in, and here comes the bone broth that I made last night, and I'm pouring the bone broth right over that. Now, this corn is frozen, and I'm putting it in there frozen. If you have time to let it thaw, I would do that, but either way, it's going to be totally fine. I'm also adding in a few peeled and quartered potatoes and bringing this to a boil before putting it into my proofing box / slow cooker. This thing is awesome. You can proof your dough in it or switch the setting to be a slow cooker. So I'm just putting it right in there and letting it cook all day. I am finishing up the chicken corn chowder. So it cooked all day, and now I am just taking out the chicken thighs and bacon so I can mash up the soup and add a few more ingredients. So I'm adding in some heavy cream. You could use half and half or whole milk if you prefer. I've made this with all three, and it's all very good. The cream is the best, but they all work. And then I'm mixing together about a quarter cup of cornstarch and probably about equal parts milk. I didn't really measure it, but kind of eyeballing about equal parts, and mixing that together and then mixing it into the soup and bringing it to a boil just to help it thicken. Once it thickens, I like to mash those potatoes just to release those starches to help thicken it a little bit more. And then of course we have to add cheese. So I shredded up some mozzarella and some cheddar. I have a little bit extra here. If you're shredding cheese, I recommend just shredding a bunch so you don't have to deal with it later for your next recipe. Then I didn't get this on camera. I forgot, I'm sorry, but I chopped up the chicken and the bacon and I'm putting it into the soup. And this is a delicious summer soup.